Debating death and memory, past and present. It's an archaeo-death debate.
Hello, Archeo Deathlings. Now, in my Twitter poll for last week, I asked which topic would you like me to address via a YouTube Archeo Death video this week, and everyone said displaying the dead in museums. Now, this is a hot topic. There's many experts and voices on this issue, and it affects both the global repatriation and reburial debate, as well as many local and regional discussions about how is it ethical to actually display the physical remains of the archaeological dead? You know, what are we achieving by doing that? And what stories do we tell? What stakeholder communities are we addressing in doing so? And some would have a very strong stance and say that actually, regardless of whether we're dealing with native populations, surviving indigenous populations or not, we should actually be considering returning most, if not all, of our archaeological collections of human remains to religious groups, stakeholder groups, or actually just for reburial in the place where they were found or close to the place where they were found. Others would go to the other extreme and say actually there's so much valuable information that can be gained from human remains, and this has been going on for 30-40 years, this debate I should say. You know, we should keep these collections, we should keep curating them, because there's many new techniques, many new questions that are going to be asked in future decades, and we won't be able to ask those questions, let alone answer them, if we don't have those skeletal collections. And indeed, before the DNA revolution, or revolutions, people were arguing that new techniques were going to go along, and actually things have been reburied that could have actually told us some very fascinating stories if we had been allowed those remains to stay in accessible installations, if not in museum curation. But the specific question of displaying the dead is a subset of all of that, because we can still keep things in museums maybe, and there's as I said, there's polls and many people in between, but there's two extremes of work to repatriate and rebury everything, and to try to maintain for scientific analysis and archaeological research questions a coherent and consistent collection. But there's many points in between. But of course, one of the key issues for all of this is it's one thing to actually have those collections, but displaying them to the public is a very specific subset question. Why do we do it, and what is achieved by it? Well, on my ArchaeoDeath blog, I have addressed this point multiple times, and I must say that I think some museums that have been lauded and celebrated as good examples of excellent practice in the way they display human remains, for me, fall short, because my criteria differ from perhaps museologists and heritage practitioners. I think there's a lot of in my publications, I've challenged some of the ways in which biases are embedded in the stories told, which human remains are put on display, and which are given most attention. And one bias, for example, I've called to account is the bias towards fleshed, articulated human remains, which tend to attract all of the debate, all of the discussion, because of their likeness, their uncanny modernness. They look like you're doing a time jump. You look like you're doing. They haven't arrested their decay. They're still got the flesh on the bones, the nails, the hair. And so, for me, while bog bodies and mummies are evocative and important fields of research and debate about their significance and whether they should be displayed, for me they're an odd and perhaps inappropriate subset to focus most of our attention on, to the detriment of other kinds of archaeological collections, including cremated remains, disarticulated skeletal collections, bones that can be used and displayed to make and evoke many stories about past human societies, but are often put on the back foot, often aren't the focus of discussion. So I must say I'm very critical of museums and heritage sites that display human remains, but equally I would say that there is a many different ways in which those displays operate in our society. Not only many different subsets of audiences that they are communicating to, from school children up to people in their latter years or their late years of their life, or reflecting on the dead. That's the other point, isn't it? That no matter how old you are, the audiences are also the dead themselves, those who are held in memory and in affection by the audiences. But in addition to that, there are many different kinds of narrative that can be told from funerary remains. And often it's not simply about the individual and their experience in the past, their dying, their death, their life before all of that, of course, but also communities, social change, population and social collapse, all sorts of narratives, disasters, violence. There's many things that can be conveyed with human remains, and that many of those stories are about the past, but some of them are actually about us and about our future and the conversations we can have with human remains in museums, collections, and the way we can discuss how those remains can be of relevance to future discussions of what we do with our dead, I think hasn't been fully explored. So I'm not. This isn't my primary area of expertise, and there are those who it is their primary focus of research into what do the dead mean to us and how do we display them in museums. I would say I have been a voice of critical evaluation of museum collections, but I'm not one of the group of people who would see it as ghoulish or inherently aberrant to have human remains on display. And indeed, put in comparative terms, many parts of the world have no problems with displaying human remains in a museum context, but of course there are still questions of respect and appropriate display. And I think we have to think very carefully and justify every single piece of human body we put on display and why it needs to be there. And if it had a purpose 10 years ago, or 5 years ago, or 3 years ago, or even last week, that doesn't necessarily justify why it's there now. We need to keep a conversation going about the appropriateness of these displays and how they tell a story. A good example for that in my blog, I take to task the English Heritage Stonehenge site, where I say that, which obviously when it opened in, I think it was 2012, there was great controversy about the display of the remains of prehistoric, Neolithic and early Bronze Age people. Within those displays, there is a body of a early Neolithic earthen long barrow occupant, a person who was buried in, not an occupant, but a person who was buried into that barrow during the early Neolithic. Then there is late Neolithic cremated material on display, and then early Bronze Age beaker folk person, a beaker grave in a crouched position. And each of those tells different stages of the story of Stonehenge. And yet equally I said that in my blog that perhaps a problem with that is that by sort of elevating certain individuals, it does sort of challenge, or it makes it difficult for the public to engage with the fact that many of these funerary rites are incredibly communal, social, ceremonial acts in which not only were lots of people involved, but lots of bodies were being buried, transformed by fire, reburied, translated. You know, there's lots of stories, connections between the dead and the living that is missed when we simply put a bunch of bones in a display case and treat them as individuals. So that is an example for you to illustrate the fact that sometimes I am supportive of displays, the human remains being there, but perhaps I'm not totally happy, or I'm quite critical in some cases of the manner in which those human remains are being deployed. And I'm not sure always, every archaeologist and every specialist will have a different view on every museum case they see, and curators have a tough job and they're never going to please everyone or anyone in some cases. But I would say that there are ongoing and intense debates to be had about if we're going to have curated collections of human remains in university departments, but also in museums. That's one thing, but displaying the dead, it's not simply about the choice of display, but how you display, what stories you tell. Now, I want to flag up that I've already had a video looking at my 2016 co-edited book, Archaeologists and the Dead, co-edited with Melanie Giles, Dr. Melanie Giles of Manchester University. And in that book, there's a whole range of different perspectives and voices on this issue, but looking from a North American, looking from a European, and looking around the world as well at how we display and curate and engage in the field as well as in the heritage context with human remains. Another collection I co-edited and did the introduction for is a digital online open access special collection of the journal AP, the online journal in public archaeology, which I co-edited, and as I said, the introduction is written by me. there's actually very few papers on museums in that collection, and indeed most of the papers deal with other kinds of heritage, public archaeological interactions between death, the dead, and archaeological practice. And yet I think the way we display the dead sits in the background to the discussions in that volume. But actually, I must point out that my most recent collection on the public archaeology of death, or the ethics and practice of whether we should display the dead in our culture, is in this book, Equinox, published at the beginning of 2019. So it's barely 18 months out of the presses. The Public Archaeology of Death, which bears this quite disturbing but realistic visualization of a double grave from an early medieval double grave from southern Scandinavia, in an article by Leszek Gedea, in which my students from a public conference and a range of experts bring together their perspectives on a whole new aspects of the public engagement of archaeologists with death and mortality that very much dovetails with the other two collections, the OUP 2016 book and the special issue, open access issue of the journal AP. And if I was going to give you a further example of how my thinking has emerged and evolved, I would draw your attention to this book, because as well as my introduction to this book, there's a paper by Marion Shiner, Katie Hema and Rhiannon Como on St Patrick's Chapel excavations. And then there are subsequently, after the chapter I'm going to discuss, discussions by Madeline Walsh and myself on the display of the Sand People at Sutton Hoo, and a critical evaluation of the Sutton Hoo display of the dead. And the stories told about not skeletal remains, but the impressions of the dead found in the excavations. And very much Sutton Hoo is about the absent dead. It's about treasure, but it's about an absent corpse. We don't have the skeletons because of the acidic soil. Very few skeletal remains were surviving. So that's an interesting case study of how we can display the dead and talk about the dead in the absence of human remains. There's a paper by Sian Mui looking at grave expectations, looking at popular and museum representations, how we recreate the dead in museums, and that has a museological dimension, as well as Chiara Bonacci looking at photographing the dead and how we portray the dead in our archaeological publications. And she looks at the popular magazines Current Archaeology and British Archaeology and looks at how they're packed full of images of the archaeological dead and evaluates that. Death on Canvas by Leszek Gedea looks at artistic reconstructions of Viking Age mortuary archaeology. That's linked to the cover. And I have a paper in here with Aaron Watson looking at how we visualise cremation practices in the past. One of my former students, Sam Munch, looks at controversy surrounding human remains from the First World War. And then another former student, Rachel Nicholson, looks at, in a very complicated title, but looks at MMOs, MMORPGs, and MOBAs or MOBAs, looking at basically online gaming and mortuary archaeology, the mortuary spaces encountered by gamers and how games interact with mortality in various ways. And finally, I have my paper Death's Drama, looking at the mortuary practices in seasons 1 to 4 of the TV show Vikings. Now, there's a lot in this book therefore, looking at the representation of death and the dead from archaeological contexts in popular culture. But the chapter I wanted to focus on is Suzanne Evans and myself, Death's Diversity, the Case of Llangollen Museum. And the reason why I wanted to flag this up in response to this video about displaying the dead is we look at, in that paper, at a little local museum in North Wales, a voluntary run, reusing a former public library space, where there is a lot of memorial content from ecclesiastical memorials, the grave slabs of the ladies of Llangollen, the famous sort of late 18th, early 20th century literary artistic figures who lived and were patrons of the arts, who lived in Llangollen, and how they are part of the museum's death space, if you like. But also a replica of the Pillar of Elizeg is the centre point of the museum, and since our excavations there in 2010 to 2012 cremated human remains from an early Bronze Age kist have been put on display outside or just below the Pillar of Elysée, as it's represented in the museum display. So you actually go into this little museum, it's only one space with lots of alcoves, and you get a sort of temporal whirlwind of different periods, different places, different artifacts, different stories about Llangollen and its locality, in which memorials to the dead and now a modest presentation of human remains are absolutely central. And our point is, most of the discussion has been about big museums, national museums, city museums. Well, actually, if we're going to evaluate the stories told and how we use human remains as part of museum displays, we need to look much more critically and carefully at these small museums where perhaps without a professional curatorial staff who are working to convey local histories, local stories, the story of place. And Llangollen Museum, for me, is a great example, which was done not necessarily as a grand design, it's a happenstance, but has put a lot of effort and work into creating a distinctive and, I think, vibrant display in which the dead, through text-mediated material culture and through human remains, are a key element. And the most recent addition to that, a piece of a visualization which is actually appearing as one of the icons on my blog and my Archaeodeath YouTube channel, is the Smiling Abbot, this newly rediscovered fragment of early 14th century abbatial funerary art. So it's from probably an abbot of the Valley Crucis Cistercian monastery, and we have his face carved crudely on a funerary monument. So it's an effigial slab. And so Llangollen Museum, I think, makes a point. It's a very distinctive display, but it makes the point that if we're going to evaluate these broader narratives of should we display the dead in museums and what do people feel, what do sort of pagan groups feel, what do indigenous groups feel, what do the great British public generally think, what do experts pronounce on these topics, we should also bear in mind the smaller, more mundane, more modest, more prosaic, more eclectic collections where maybe only one Bronze Age pot and maybe one skeleton from a medieval collection, but these local small-scale museums can tell rich and engaging stories about mortality and human societies past and present through their archaeological remains. So I haven't got an answer to the big question of should we display the dead. I mean, I am saying yes, but perhaps we constantly need to evaluate, reflect, shift what we do depending on context. And context, again, is, I'm one of these wishy-washy people. I don't say yes, definitely, or no, definitely not. I'm saying it really does depend on context. And there's so many factors we need to bear in mind when thinking about the display of the human remains. And unless we are perhaps, should we have a sort of a puritanical view on these matters, where we think it all should be purged and all collections should be returned, or the other hand, you just think it doesn't matter, they're all dead, just chuck them in there. I think we have to be, a responsibility on us is to look at perhaps small, poorly funded museums struggling to get by, particularly with the pandemic knock-on effect, that have always, at least in the last 20, 30 years, have worked to develop engaging collections, and human remains have been an important part of them. So that's not a definitive answer for you, but it's something for you to think about, to get away from most of the literature which is on bog bodies, mummies, and perhaps prized or prestigious city centre or national museum collections where exceptional examples of the remains of the dead are displayed. And the Llangollen Museum also makes the point that so many of these displays don't involve necessarily human remains. They involve memorial and mortuary material cultures rather than just bodies. And if we're going to think about the ethics of displaying the dead, it shouldn't be just the displaying of skeletal material. It should be about all the materials derived from mortuary contexts and memorial environments that we pack into our museum. So I did find it ironic, for example, that the Museums Unlock initiative that went through the pandemic lockdown, communicating what's in museums out of, when all the museums are shut, had a policy of not displaying any human remains, but was happy to show images of objects rifled from tombs in colonial times and more recently. And so we have this awkward double standard that human remains for some are special and should be, treated with reverence, and maybe in some cases not even displayed at all. But we're happy to decontextualize objects that were found and had been past people had put in funerary context and on memorials. We're happy for those to be on display. So it's about thinking through the bigger issues beyond simply human remains, beyond the big museums, and beyond the fleshed human remains. So I hope that's given you some thoughts on where I stand on this topic, and I hope to come back. My blog will continue to tackle individual museum case studies and my feelings about them. So it's all about thinking through the challenges we face with these individual collections. So I hope that was of use. And there are many different views on this, and it's another heated, controversial topic that we teach on the MA Archaeology of Death and Memory at the University of Chester, and where I supervise students, undergraduate students, master students. And I may return to this theme because in the new year, my university has a annual archaeology student conference, which I've been organising, and we've led to publications. And the sixth one is going to be looking at particularly digideath, the digital dimensions of displaying the dead, the digital dimensions of dealing with images of the dead, the archaeological excavation itself, and the display of those remains. And so my students are going to be tackling that topic too. So I shall be hopefully coming back and addressing it and reflecting on what their take is on this thorny issue. Thank you.
Follow ArchaeoDeath on WordPress, or you'll never learn.